It was funny when Specialized launched the Tarmac SL8 because they run through this comparison. It's like the Venge here and it's like the Aethos there, but it also shares some DNA with the SL7. So as I was listening to this, I'm like, okay, I've owned and ridden every single one of these bikes, so let's see what the SL8 is all about. And after riding it for 500 miles, I'm ready to give it a proper review. Is it more Venge? Is it more Aethos? Is it just an updated SL7? Or is it just a total flop? So in this video, we're gonna run through a few different things. We're gonna talk about my particular build. We're gonna talk about my thoughts on the aesthetics, the ride quality, the handling characteristics, the value, and then I'll offer somewhat of a roundup of all of my thoughts on this bike. So feel free to skip ahead as you please in this video. Let's make one thing clear up front. This isn't a sponsored video. No one sent me this SL8 frame for a review. I paid full price just like everyone else. And second, I'm not gonna do a deep dive into tech specs. Take a look at the Specialized website for that. And there are tons of like first look and first ride impression videos out there. But unfortunately, I think that's kind of where they stop. We're calling this one Sirius Black. Yes, after the famous Prisoner of Azkaban. You can tell which book we're reading in my family. And this also might be unique in that I've transferred every component over from my SL7. So my thoughts are really isolated to just the frame. Now this is a full SRAM Red build with a 4835 SRAM Force crankset. I just prefer the all black crankset, and the 4835 seemed like a logical move for the climbing that I did in France. This has a Revolve Rapide cockpit in 120 millimeters by 400 millimeters. I'm running two different sets of wheels with this build. I've got a set of NV45s with 28 millimeter Continental GP5000 STR tires, and a set of NV23s with 30 millimeter Vittoria Corsa Pros, each sealed with orange sealant. I've got a Pro Stealth Carbon saddle that's kind of on all my bikes right now, and this has a ceramic speed coated bottom bracket. This frame is a size 56, it's a Project Black. I'm 6 foot and I ride a 56 across the board. And even with this not being the ultra light ready to paint frame, with the NV23s, this comes in at just under 15 pounds, so pretty dang light. The original leaks of the SL8 were very concerning to say the least, and I think most would agree that if you see the SL8 in person, those concerns are quite overstated. And to the untrained eye, it would be hard to distinguish it from the SL7. I've even been on several group rides and someone has asked me, dude, when are you getting the new Tarmac? And my quick reply is, I'm currently on it, check it out. And they have no idea. In one of the marketing pieces, it was explained that the front end was very influenced by the Venge and the rear end was very influenced by the Aethos. But you know what, I've been on several different group rides and I've had a friend on the SL8 in front, an SL6 over here, an Aethos, and a Venge over here, and I can tell you that I think the rear end is more SL6 than Aethos. The front end reminds me more of the SL7 than the Venge, even though the front end feels more Venge, which we'll talk about later. It's like a taller SL7 head tube. Aesthetically, I do see the Aethos DNA in the more rounded tubes and the toothpick thin seat stays. We can't gloss over those. They're seriously so incredibly thin. It'll be interesting to see how those hold up with airline travel. In the general scope of bikes on the market, I think the SL8 is a good looking bike. I do not, however, think it's as good looking as the SL7. Say what you want about aerodynamic advantages, if I'm just looking at the bike aesthetically, it doesn't look as good as the SL7. The aesthetics are also greatly improved by the Revolve Rapide cockpit. As of right now, late August, it seems like those are impossible to find, but I really think that it completes the look of the SL8. I also think that it was the right call to limit the tire clearance to 32 millimeters. Any bigger and you run into the issue of 28 millimeter and even 30 millimeter tires looking like they're swimming inside of the front fork, especially when you consider there's always a little bit of wiggle room because a 32 millimeter tire on something like my Reserve 4044s with a 25.5 mil internal width is gonna measure like a 33 or 34 millimeter. So if you're stating 35 millimeter clearance like other bikes are doing, you're just creating a huge area to account for variances in wheel tire interfaces. Anyways, I digress. Let's talk about ride quality. If it's Venge in the front and Aethos in the back, some would argue that they've created a dream bike. I'm not so sure that I'd agree, and here's why. My first ride on the SL8 was along the coast and through some of our local canyons. I walked away from that first 100-mile ride asking myself, where is the Aethos portion of this bike? And I don't mean that in a negative way, it's just not what I expected. Look, I own the Aethos and it was good, but I ultimately went back to the Tarmac SL7 because the performance was something that I loved. That's not to say that the Aethos doesn't have that level of performance, it's just that the SL7 was so sharp and responsive, whereas the Aethos is kind of floaty and almost too well-mannered, if that makes sense. It's just a different type of performance. Fast forward to the SL8, and I immediately felt the Venge-like stiffness on the front end. From the moment I jumped out of the saddle, started climbing, and shifted my weight forward, it reminded me of the 3rd generation Venge. You could argue that it's due to the one-piece cockpit, but I think that it's primarily due to the stiffness and the construction of the frame. The SL8 is a fantastic climbing bike, maybe the best I've ever ridden. If there's any part of the Aethos that I feel, it's during climbs, as the power transfer feels really smooth when you hop out of the saddle, and in the way that the rear end absorbs a lot of the road chatter. It makes for a very smooth ride and is ultra responsive. Look, it's still a tarmac at heart, but it feels a little easier on the body. The new one-piece cockpit feels great. And if you've been riding the Aerofly 2 bars on a previous generation Venge or an SL7, these will feel very familiar. I came from traditional round bars on my SL7, and I was pleasantly surprised at how quickly I adjusted back to bars with such a large flat top area. They feel plenty comfortable to me. The claims say it's 8 watts faster than the old tarmac, and yes, I've watched all of the videos on the internet, ones from Peak Torque and others breaking down these claims. And look, can I feel the 8 watts? You know what, not in an isolated sense, and I think that most of us would struggle to quantifiably feel those 8 watts outside of a very controlled environment. Is it fast in a straight line? Absolutely. Did I expect it to all of a sudden be as fast as a TT bike? No way, I mean, come on, it's still a road bike. Handling is where the SL8 really started to move the needle for me in a way that I didn't expect, and allow me to pull in the Venge and some car references to explain myself. One thing that I liked about the Venge was the way that it handled. It was really stiff and also really responsive, meaning that your input was immediately felt, yet it required a little bit more input than your typical road bike. I think its problem was that it had a little bit of understeer, and I think that's why it turned some people off to the Venge, especially those of you who came from an SL6. The SL8 takes handling and precision to another level. And the best way that I can describe it is, if you've ever driven a high-end sports car, well, let's just use like a 911 GT3 RS, for example. Most of us are familiar with a Porsche 911, right? So if you're driving around one of these cars, it's quick, it's responsive, and then you push that drive mode button and you select Sport Plus or Track mode. And all of a sudden, the whole driving experience changes. The exhaust note changes, the car starts to sit lower, the suspension tightens. All of a sudden, the steering even feels tighter, and it feels like you are instantaneously connected to the road. Yes, maybe you have to work a little bit more because that steering is so tight, but you're handsomely rewarded with exceptional handling. And that is the SL8. There's no understeer, there's no oversteer, it's just the right level of responsiveness and feedback from the road, and it's literally instantaneous. Maybe that's a byproduct of the unique marriage of the Venge and the Aethos, but to me, it feels more like a marriage of the Venge and the SL7, and I like that a lot. Full builds run $14,000 plus tax for the S-Works version, fully kitted out with top of the line everything. $8,500 for the Pro with kind of like that next tier down. The S-Works frames come in at $5,500 and the $3,500 for the Pro frame, which seems to fall in line with a lot of the big brands on the market, with the exception of Canyon, who's always like a third lower. And if you're looking for the best value available, the Pro models are probably the way to go. You save a couple $1,000s just on the frame alone, and you really get a lot of the performance benefits. So where do I land on this bike? First, you have to understand that my expectations were really high. I mean, after all, whether you want to admit it or not, this is the bike that's supposed to lead the industry. And second, it's a very expensive bike, and so I expect almost perfection out of a bike at this price point. And on paper, it met my expectations. It was faster, lighter, it was more stiff in just the right areas. It wasn't until I rode the SL8 that I realized that it not only met my expectations, but it exceeded them in a few different areas. It handles better than I expected, it's more lively and climbs better than I expected, and it holds speed and is faster than I expected. It's like putting your bike into Sport Plus or Track mode. It just becomes a more exciting bike to ride. The SL8 becomes more exhilarating the more you push it, and the more you push it, the more it delivers. That's the part of the Venge that I feel like was lost and is now found. And that's a feeling that's hard to quantify in a wind tunnel or put into a white paper. And if you're looking for a direct SL8 versus SL7 comparison, well, we'll talk about that more next week. I've put almost 15,000 miles on two different SL7s. I've got some thoughts to share. In fact, I think it might be the more well-rounded bike of the two. We're also gonna talk about different wheel set depths. I've been riding these NV23s and these NV45s, and I think we should all probably have a more shallow set of wheels. There are a lot of benefits that I think we're missing out on. I'll talk about the Vittoria Corsa Pros that I've been riding for almost 1,000 miles now. I think it's an exceptional tire. And you know what? A lot of people said that I would have issues with these tires, but I've had no issues whatsoever. It's been a fantastic tire. Anyways, if you have any questions, drop me a comment below. And until next time.